Okay, everybody. So now we're going to be taking a look today at what the French are up to, and then with what's going on with the slave trade that we talked a little bit about yesterday. So the French, as opposed to the English, are actually going to have a much, much better relationship with the native population of North America. And that is because there was a much smaller population of French people in North America. So we don't have a lot coming over as opposed to the English. For example, we might have, say, in the British colonies, the 13 colonies, we might have just a nice round number, 1,000,000 people in the year, let's say, 1690. But there are only 10,000 French people. That's the kind of ratio that we're looking at. Now, French colonization is going to be in big part because of Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain. And yes, that's Jacques, not Jacques. I've had plenty of students pronounce it that way. That is not the French way of pronouncing the name. Now, Jacques Cartier, he would attempt looking for the Northwest Passage. Did not work out. He would try to set a settlement in place in Quebec, which is a major city in Canada today. It didn't work out for him, but he did set a bunch of stuff in motion. Now, he is the person who named Canada. He names it after Kanata, which is like a translated word for village or settlement by the Huron and Iroquois natives in their language. Now, Samuel de Champlain, he would make a number of voyages. He'd been in the Caribbean, but one of his more prominent things is that he actually would establish a permanent settlement at Quebec. And that is going to be 67 years after Cartier. Now, New France is what Canada was called at this time. And kind of really the only thing that you really need to know here is just look at the territory on the map compared to the English. Lots and lots of territory. They had lots and lots of agreements with native tribes and trade. They was more of just a business venture for France. And you can see as time went on, they would also gain access into the Louisiana territory. So population, as I was saying before, very slow growth. By 1700, there were only about 15,000 French people, partially because they would have a limit on who was even allowed to go to Canada. Like Huguenots, the Protestants of France, they were not allowed to go there. Only Catholics were able to go there. And because of the small populations that were allowed to go there, they depended heavily on their Indian allies, so they treated them better. It was very cohesive. They worked very well together in this way. They would do much better than the English in relations, and especially better than the Spanish, because I think we all know how that turned out. Now, the fur trade. We talked a little bit about it last time. Some of the other animals that they would have been after are like fox and otter, so rarer furs in Europe. They would trade items that the natives wanted, like beads, pots, knives, cloth, other metal objects, glass, and in exchange for the furs that they wanted. So that was basically the business. Now, why are colonies important? What purpose do they serve? I'll give you a second just to kind of think of an idea, and then we'll go ahead and move on. All right. It goes to this idea of mercantilism. It's about money. So mercantilism is an economic system that relies on acquiring gold to make countries rich, and having a positive balance of trade, meaning you're selling more stuff than you are buying. Therefore, you're having a abundance of money. You're making a profit. And the way to do all of this is having colonies. You have colonies to get raw materials that you then ship back to the home country where all the factories are. You process the raw materials into goods that you then sell back to the colonies and to other countries that you have business deals with for a profit. So the idea is colonies are used through this economic system of mercantilism to make your country rich. Now, the Spanish would have a very rigid class system, and at the very top are people called peninsulares. These are people from Spain who live in the colonies. They're at the top. Then you have the Creoles, which are people who were born in the colony, but their parents were born in Spain. Now you have the Mestizos, which are people who are Spanish and Indian in origin. Then you have the Mulattoes, which are Spanish and African in their mixing. And then you have the Native Americans, and then you have the African slaves. That's the social class in your typical Spanish colony at this time. And other colonies would have similar structures, but the Spanish got the most rigid and like tight way of dividing up things. Now, the colonies would also imitate the culture of the country that controls them. So if you're in Quebec, you're going to see a lot of French ways of doing things. If you're in, you know, in Williamsburg, in Virginia, you're going to feel more like you're in England. If you're in Havana, Cuba, you're going to feel more of a Spanish environment in the culture that you are in. All right. Now, I did mention earlier on in the lesson that there was a lot of trading posts being established along the African coast. And a lot of these trading posts, they would deal in slaves, gold, and other products, primarily gold and slaves being the things that are moving. So yeah, we're going to start getting into some of the not so fun stuff, but it's things that we need to know to understand how we get to where we are today in race relations. Okay? But before we get to that, we're going to just talk about some other things. So Asia, there is competition for who's going to trade with Asia. The Portuguese, they got there first, so they have already been established. The Dutch and British are also going to get involved. And what we're going to see is different influences, spheres of influence in India and in China about who's going to do business where and who's going to get what items. But of course, everybody wants in. All right. The Chinese, they did not want a lot of influence. Okay. So they would actually set up a lot of policies to control foreign trade in China. And that would be just a big deal for them. Now, discovery of the Americas would lead to an exchange called the Columbian Exchange. We have already talked about this a little bit. And it's basically the idea of what animals and plants and diseases are going from the old world to the new world and from the new world to the old world. So like horses are going to the new world, to the Americas. There had never even been a horse in the Americas like with people until the Spanish arrived. And nobody in Europe had ever smoked tobacco until it was brought over from the Americas. Now, I know you guys have seen a chart similar to this. Here's just a different one, but it's all the same basic things. All right. This is just going into that a little bit more. Feel free to pause and take a look at it, but we will move on. Now, Western Hemisphere, we get products like corn, potatoes, and tobacco, three very important products. And coming from Europe, horses and cattle are going to completely change the way that life is done. We start getting native tribes in the West that become horse-based cultures. They help them move around more easily and are able to do more things. Cattle is going to completely change dietary things in North America because, like some Native Americans are going to, steal cows, they're going to hunt cows, but also they're going to influence the land because what's like the quote unquote native cattle of North America? The bison, buffalo. Buffalo are going to be pushed and killed to get out of the way so that way white settlers can make room for their cattle farms, which is going to completely change the lifestyle of Native Americans as well. But of course, that's a little bit later on from the time period we're focusing on right now, but it's something to keep in mind. Now, the Spanish were getting so much gold and silver from North America that it would actually cause them to go into a big money problem. There was just too much money, so it didn't mean as much. So yeah, it would completely screw up their economy because they had too much money, which never thought that would really be a thing, but it did happen. All right. Now, talking about the diseases, somewhere around 90% of the entirety of North American and South American native populations would end up dead. 90%. Mexico alone, from the time that basically Cortez was there into 130 years later, the death rate would kill about 94% of the population, from 25 million down to 1 million people. The island of Hispaniola, which is where Columbus first landed, the population would drop from 250,000, 250,000 people to 500 people in only 46 years. That's less than a lifetime. That is almost that is 99% death rate. That is catastrophic losses of life. Now, one of the original ideas was, native peoples in the Americas were going to be used as slaves on the plantations. But because so many of them died off, this is how we actually get the African slave trade, bringing Africans by force to the New World. So buckle up, guys, because this is going to be one of those times that it's going to be unpleasant, but we need to know it to understand it. Now, one of the biggest drives is actually the Caribbean and South America, where the sugar plantations were. About, more slaves went to the Caribbean and to South America than came to North America. We'll be seeing some of that statistic in a little bit. So we do not know how many slaves actually were transported out of Africa. There's a rough estimate that somewhere between 10 and 15 million came over, but only about 500,000 to 700,000 of them actually came to what would become the United States. So that's only how many were actually brought to North America. The rest of them were all brought to the Caribbean and to South America to work on sugar plantations. Sugar is a very, very labor-intensive crop. And of course, we know this form of slavery was based on race, and that partially the reason why that Africans were chosen is because they actually already had immunity to a number of European diseases, and they would be less likely to die off from these diseases, unlike the native populations of the Americas. So it was a little more convenient in that way, which I know is a really weird way of saying it. So the demand for slaves would create this whole business. Slavery became a very prominent business. West African kingdoms would actually make a business of selling their rivals into slavery. It became a business. They would go send their warriors out, they would attack enemy villages and towns, and they would take prisoners. Those prisoners, in turn, would be sold into slavery to, French slave traders, Portuguese slave traders, English slave traders, and then they would bring them over to the New World and they would sell them to the colonies who need the slave labor. So that is how the slave trade happened. Now, the route that the slaves would go through when coming over is called the Middle Passage. It is a dreadful thing that we get to talk about now. The slave ships, they were basically, these pictures right here, this is basically a diagram of how it was done. So to maximize the number of people that these ships could carry, every square inch was being taken up by either supplies for the crew and a little bit for the slaves, and just room to hold the slaves. They would be stacked. They would figure you would have no more room than you would if you were laying in a coffin, and you're chained in place. There's no bathroom, so you're having to mess on yourself. It's hot, it's humid, it's hard to breathe, and you've got all those smells of sweaty people and other nastiness all around you. If someone died, they're pretty much there until they get noticed, and the body would just be pitched over the side. And it was atrocious, horrible conditions that these people would be forced to go through. Now, food and water, if there was any, was not in the best condition. A lot of these slaves fell ill. A lot of people would actually commit suicide. So like if someone was able to get loose, they would, jump overboard. Sometimes, if a slave was sick, sometimes they would be brought up on deck to see if the fresh air and the sun and all would help them recover. Sometimes it did work, sometimes it got worse, and then they were just pitched over the side anyway. Sometimes you would have groups of people, if they got loose, would jump over the side and have a suicide pact. And sometimes if the ship got low on food and water just in general, they would throw people overboard just so that there would be more food to go around for everybody else. It's messed up. I'm not trying to make excuses for any of it. It is messed up, but it happened. Now, during the roughly 2-month trip from Africa to the New World, it's estimated that somewhere between 14 and 20% of the people died in the crossing, which would actually add another 4 to 5 million people who were slaves being brought to the West. So it's closer to 15 to 20 million people were taken from Africa, but only about 10 to 15 actually made it here. Now, the Middle Passage is a part of the triangular trade. So just to show what it all is, so from Europe down to Africa, we have, we're trading goods that we have made in Europe to Africa in exchange for slaves who are being brought to the Americas to farm and process raw materials. And those raw materials are then in turn brought to Europe, where they can be manufactured into luxury goods to be sold to Africa for more slaves. And it's just a vicious cycle like that. So to help break it down just a little bit more, take a look at this. All right, that is going to do it for our discussion on, the age of discovery. So next time you will have a quiz on this material and we will begin looking at our next area. All right, so that's going to do it for today, and I will talk to you guys next time.